I'm gonna just, here we go. Okay, so Maria, let me know when you start recording and I'll do the introduction. Right, should we just wait like 2-3 minutes? Everyone got very silent, so I don't know if everything is going well.
All good from here, Pat.
Fantastic. So I'm just waiting a few minutes so like the bit late comers can join us in, and then we'll start the introduction. So everyone can like participate. I hope it's gonna go well. We'll see time-wise how it's gonna be. We have 2-hour slot, but we'll see if it starts kind of dying out. We can always do shorter, or I can stay longer. So we'll see. Right. Right, Maria, can you start recording already? Oh, I can't hear you. I can't hear.
It's already recording, but we'll
okay.
we'll edit that bit.
Okay, fantastic. So I hope everyone can see my slides. I'm gonna slowly start with the introduction, and then I will forward with everything else. So I hope everyone can hear me well. I want to welcome those that I haven't had the chance to chat with directly yet on our panel discussion, little workshop titled West Midlands and the International Business of Creative Culture, a Globalized Local Perspective. For those who don't know me or haven't spotted me anywhere on in the local venues, my name is Patricia. I'm a senior lecturer at Aston University and a PI of the project Birmingham Live Music Project. So kind of, I have been terrorizing a lot of people with my emails, awkward chats when I kind of go with my microphone and going, how many people work for you in the venue and things like that. So first, few organizational points for those joining in. If you're not speaking or so if you're not panelist or not speaking, not asking questions or not requested otherwise, please switch off your camera and microphone in order to have easier communication with all of us. Please post questions in the chat window and through raise hand. We'll collect questions and ask them later on after the panelists are actually done with their short presentations. Just in case, the whole panel will be recorded, and we will later on distribute link to the recording so we can have a look at it later on. Just small organizational stuff. First, we're gonna have a set of short talks, each maximum 5 minutes. I will be timing them. And then we will actually move towards the more discussion section. So first, shortly, an introduction, how the panel came about. So it's part of the project, but in general terms, we figured out it's really important to focus on various projects and initiatives happening in West Midlands and beyond, which are focused on creative culture sector, including live music, and impact and a response to the current situation. And in our case, we always operate with examples of Brexit and COVID, but obviously there are other elements coming into play. We have mixture of speakers, so let me kind of shift for a second. We have Erica Love from Culture Central West Midlands Creative Response Unit. We also have Michael Creel joining us from Nighttime Industries Association. And then two of my colleagues from the Birmingham Live Music Project, Adam Bear from Newcastle University and Craig Hamilton from Birmingham City University. So we hope it's going to be quite intensive and very interesting debate. After the talks, we're going to focus in general terms on a set of questions listed here. We can obviously expand on those, and I'm looking forward to actually implementing questions from people participating in the panel. But we're focusing on things like activities that organizations and projects conduct to address current situation, economic and social cultural effects of Brexit and COVID on creative culture sector, and nighttime economy. How can we ensure thriving nighttime economy, and kind of more specific challenges, barriers, and opportunities to ensure sustainability of the sector? And final question, kind of wrapping that up, what can we learn from the national, or rather regional level and local level, in order to inform activities at the national level? Just before I forget, and those interested more in the work of the project, I really would encourage you to check out Birmingham live music map, which we prepared in the project. Is still active and available. Have a look there, and there will be a newest version coming on very shortly. And also, for all the participants, I really encourage to try one of our surveys, which informs our research, and it's quite helpful when we get more responses. Again, we will share the slides and recordings later on, but just in case, if you want to follow us a bit more on the work that we're doing, we're quite active on the webpage and our social media, so here's the information. Right, so without further ado, I'll ask first Erica to start us with talk from perspective of her organization. So stop sharing my screen. And Erica, you may now take over.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So for those who don't know me, there's only a couple of people in the room that I do know, to be fair. So I'm Erica. I am Director of Culture Central. And yeah, Patricia's kind of, we had a good chat about how culture can link into these kind of, obviously the cultural sector is, live music is a huge part of that. So just kind of making sure that we are collaborating and part of these conversations. So I am going to share my screen very briefly. It's a bit of a provocation today, just kind of, I suppose, giving a background of where the wider sector is at the moment, but also what we think the opportunities are for the region as we start to move through this these challenging times. So let's get this technology working. Give me 1 second. Share screen. That one. That has worked, yay. Do that bit. So that's where I'm up to. So this is the provocation, really. So in the light of the extreme challenges of COVID-19 and obviously Brexit, what are the challenges, and how do we look forward and build a more equitable and inclusive sector? As the kind of provocation that I have looked at. Oh, my little cursor's not working. To move it on. There we go. So the state of the sector at the moment, which will be echoing exactly where things are with live music, is the majority of venues, in terms of certainly theatres, are still closed. A few museums have started to open. We're starting to see some heritage sites. Some of the much smaller heritage sites are starting to open, but that's it. It's very limited, with many announcing that they are likely to stay closed until towards the end of this year, if not some into early next year. Things like Hippodrome are it's looking at February. In terms of their theatre venues, however, we'll go on to the kind of the innovations and shifts that we're seeing. Our festivals and events are again extremely limited, some small outdoor work happening, but obviously the idea of getting people into large amounts of people into spaces is just not possible with the current restrictions, and obviously safety of audiences as well. Freelancers, again, hard hit across the whole of the country in terms of this sector, but obviously in lots of other sectors. But we're seeing 100% of work drying up for some of those in a lot of cases. We're seeing up to 80% of staff on furlough, and certainly in certain the venues, and again a lot of front of house staff, travel, touring, all halted. Which so we have a huge amount of touring companies in our region, and that also includes touring of festival and events over this summer period, which have obviously just kind of nothing's happened. So very much the focus at the moment is survival with the Cultural Recovery Fund. That's it really. How do they just make it through at the moment? What we think is likely to happen next. So again, across the board, we are going to see quite significant redundancies. We've seen announcements from again quite large venues, and I think that's going to trickle down as we start to see the impact of the Cultural Recovery Fund, and it will be 40% of the workforce in some of those cases. Part of the Cultural Recovery Fund, if you've probably looked at it, they're asking organisations to have considered every possible option, and that includes restructuring and redundancies as part of that plan. There's a huge question that we all face around the economic balancing of opening as well. So is social distancing going to work for for venues in terms of economies of scale. And what does that look like? So that's also that audience confidence and messaging. And what's been interesting is we have obviously done a huge amount of surveys and work around what we think perceptions are of audiences coming back. But it's just about the confidence and safety and how long it's going to take for people to feel comfortable coming back. And there is the looming Brexit and the uncertainty around what that's going to look like, and what impact it's going to have specifically on those who have international work. However, what I also wanted to talk about, going backwards just too much now, around all of that, is that, you know, there are opportunities through all of this as well. We have seen massively a collaboration and partnership that has not been, as far as I'm concerned, across the region, not seen that there was ways of working before. Specifically around how we link creative and commercial, and I think this is where we need to start working quite a little bit harder. Certainly the arts and cultural sector across the region as a regional piece of work has been good as part of the West Midlands Culture Response Unit, and it's really going to, I think, as we go forward, that this is something that we really need to focus on, that we have a collective voice as a sector, and that we can champion and lobby the value of arts and culture within our society. I think there is innovation that's likely to happen as well, and they're already starting to see, as I mentioned, the Hippodrome closing, so they're not opening their theatre, but what they are bringing soon is their Van Gogh exhibition, which is a UK first, and completely transforming their space, their indoor space, for a different practice and something different and new, which will not only help obviously the Hippodrome in terms of their profile and income, but all of that area all around Southside, which is a nighttime economy area, and bringing visitors in and around that space of Birmingham. So I think they're sort of things. Again, we're seeing innovation in terms of digital and collaboration, so live streaming, but also, you know, we saw the CBSO's festival 100-year concert that took place in a warehouse in Longbridge, you know, with a huge, you know, they managed to get all of them, not all of their orchestra, I don't think, but kind of, you know, a full large orchestra in that space, live streamed around the world. From what I understand, I think they've already had up to about 170,000 views of that concert, worldwide, from countries where they were supposed to be touring in this year as well, and raised quite a significant amount of money for their fundraising campaign. I think we can see small scale innovations as well, and how people are thinking about taking work outdoors, and how is this shifting kind of programming? What does work look like outdoors? What are those shorter scales? And also kind of therefore thinking about cross-fertilisation of audiences, and therefore making it more accessible. Again, we've seen as part of the Culture Response Unit, there's a lot of live streams, real strong collaborations between small organisations, which moves on to that kind of sense of accessibility. So building that on, you know, as you're starting to build online, you are allowing people to be more accessible, but also the platforms that we're allowed to do through these collaborations mean that we can kind of focus on people being able to come and see more things, but also reach a different demographic in terms of audience. If you've seen our Democratisation of Culture weekend, which is happening a week on Saturday, again, we've got some great young creatives who are being showcased and platformed through a collaboration with Create Central, and a real diverse mix of artists and audiences sharing a message, with quite a significant amount of those being about their experience of working in the sector. The other opportunities, we do have our large scale regional events, which I don't need to say a huge amount about, but how do we maximise on those as a wider sector? So how do we link up with nighttime economy as part of the cultural programme? How do we think about how we move audiences from the large events into our kind of towns and cities and high streets, into taking part in the cultural offering that is around, that is in addition to the games as well. And then finally, you know, in terms of inclusivity and diversity, we know that there is a huge amount of work to do, but actually I think the time through COVID, obviously Black Lives Matters movement has created definite kind of a platform for us to be able to rebuild the sector as it starts to rebuild, that is more inclusive and more accessible. We have our programme of More Than a Moment, which is how we are doing kind of radically listening, and a pledge for and with the Black creative workforce in our region. And I'm just going to finish because it feels like sometimes, just a bit of information, there we go, by the way, for everybody who hasn't already got that information, is about cultural infrastructure and the importance of arts and culture in our towns and cities. Really worth the read, and we can send that around if you haven't already read it. But it talks about jobs, footfall, obviously community cohesion, and how it makes a massive difference. And yeah, I suppose I'm interested, as part of the panel discussions, what do you think? What do you think the future should look like? And I think we'll take that forward. And then I'm going to stop sharing this screen and share the other one. And I'm hoping most of you will have seen it, but it does feel like yes, everything is really quite tough at the moment, and it's not looking like it's getting, or immediately better. But how do we have this opportunity to do this? So try and do this. Ooh. Oh, hang on a second, it's sharing the wrong thing. Give me 1 minute.
The comeback, that fabled return to glory from the jaws of defeat. But perhaps our greatest comeback is yet to be seen. We're no stranger to hardship, scarred by war, bombs, closures, conflict. We've had our denigrators and haters, but none of that has ever fazed us. We've come back before. This is the workshop of the world after all. Pioneers raised in these streets, shaping game changers, thinkers, winners, heroes hidden in plain sight, a place where great industry was brought to life. There's something very special about the beat in the heart of the country. A whole lot of love to go around in our towns. But now,
COVID-19, this virus,
our lives came to a grinding halt. Our families separated. Our icons silenced, our businesses crushed. Last orders called, our kitchens shut. Our museums, our venues, our galleries, empty without purpose. As we remember those we have lost. But even when things get tough, we will always pull each other up. And if you didn't know by now, we are the boxer that doesn't stay down. A phoenix rising from the flames, a roaring lion that could never be tamed. We will come back strong. And those things that we took for granted will be cherished. And the hundreds of thriving independent businesses that survive will flourish. And as for us, we got creative. We listened more, connected more, loved more, shared more, even from the confines of our own homes. Life sprang around us. The birds sang in long forgotten chorus. We breathed better air. Nature reset. And when the cloud lifts, the light will flood in. We will come back strong, West Midlands. Our venues will pack again. In our restaurants or on our streets, we will feast. Our theatres and cinemas will entertain us. Our pubs will open their doors. In the stadiums of our heroes, we will roar louder than ever before. We will descend upon our markets, our arcades. We will shake hands once again. And on the walls of our cities, we will mark the days when we came out of the dark. The days when Birmingham and the West Midlands, the best Midlands, ignited a fire that burned so brightly the darkness never wanted to return. And we can look forward once more to our moments in the spotlight. You really don't know what you've got till it's gone. But our time will come again. And the comeback is done.
Thank you, Erica, for sharing it. It's very inspirational, and let's hope the comeback is really on very shortly and we don't have to wait another year to actually look into new events. Okay, I have now Michael listed as the next speaker. So floor is yours, Michael.
unmute myself. Hi there, can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, all good.
Thank you for the opportunity. Sorry about being outside, or not sorry, because the weather's actually not too bad. But my name's Mike Hill. I'm the Chief Executive for the NTIA, or Nighttime Industries Association. We represent a a body that's national across the UK. We're also a body in Australia and different parts of the world. But our representation is about the ecosystem, which is the nighttime economy, which runs between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning. So our representation is about the front-end businesses, the events, the festivals, the freelancers, the bus staff, the LLPs, the production staff, etc. in the background, which are vitally important for us to maintain such a globally significant industry. The value of our industry is 66 billion annually, or up until the point that we went through to this COVID period was up to 66 billion. And we employ 1.3 million people within this industry, which is an amazing industry, which is has the depth of character and entrepreneurial spirit like no other industry in this country, and it's something that I've always been very proud of and very sort of passionate about driving forward. My experience has always been, I've been a promoter. I was a drum and bass promoter for many years. I've worked in live, I've worked in corporates, I've owned my own businesses, my own venues. So for many of you that are on the call, you will understand that sometimes it's very difficult to appreciate some of the challenges within this industry without being integrally involved or having an access point to the sector to have a complete feel and understanding of what it's like to either lose money, face conflict, deal with regulators, etc. So the NTIA, since March, since the beginning of this very difficult period, has been engaged with government in Westminster, Scottish Government and Welsh Assembly Government, talking to them about the challenges around the industry, giving feedback, trying to structure the best representation at a governmental level to ensure that voices are heard, through the furlough scheme announcement, through things like commercial rent and commercial tenant challenges, through Forgotten Limited campaigns, to the Let Us Dance campaign, which was about us making sure that DCMS in particular recognised contemporary music or dance music as something, a cultural significant business or industry out there that wasn't taken into account when we looked at the Cultural Recovery Fund, which was put out. And we fought very, very hard, campaigned hard, and we got a lot of people around us to ensure that to push that forward. And Lyle and people that are on this call were fundamentally, and Pete Jordan and some of the other people on this call were fundamentally around that and supported that campaign for quite a long period, or to get us to the point that it was recognised. During that period, as you can appreciate, there have been some ups and downs. There have been lockdowns, there have been localised lockdowns. To even today, we're hearing the northeast being locked down. As you can understand, we're hearing many of these discussions in the background, speaking to PHE and some of the sort of chief medical officers and some of their findings and understanding, and in many occasions, misconceptions of what the nighttime economy looks like. So some of the projects that we've been working on recently, and it was great to hear Erica talk about Birmingham and some of those sort of inspiring pieces, particularly the video at the end, which is very inspiring. The big thing that we've been focused on, or there are two things that we've been focused on as an association. One is open are the businesses that are not able to open at the moment. And two is to ensure that there is a sustainable financial package for those businesses that are potentially open but not able to operate at the capacity that they require to break even, and for us to get a financial package that are going to support not only rateable value businesses but non-rateable value businesses, and sole traders and freelancers who all are in a similar position, and they are, absolutely financially stretched. And culturally, we're on the verge of potentially losing a huge swathe of very professional, amazingly talented people from an industry which is world renowned. And I believe, for one, it's something that we need to fight hard for. So talking about what we have been doing, we've been liaising very heavily with DCMS and BAYS, and have recently submitted something called it's by the Institute of Occupational Medicine. And what it does is we asked this body, who's a reputable body throughout the world, to look at the current evidence, scientific evidence that is available to government, and look at dissecting it and understanding what mitigating measures can be put in place to allow businesses that are not open and businesses that are open to effectively be able to operate at a greater level and be able to open businesses that are not able to open at the moment. So we put a lot of time and effort into putting this document together. It's now brought cabinet interest, and we've been sitting not only with Welsh Government, Scottish Government not as far down the line, but definitely Welsh Government and Westminster, talking to PHE and talking to environmental health and scientific officers about ways and methods that we can reopen the doors. So our biggest challenge always is understanding what the thresholds are. So if you take something as simple as this and you look at it from a perspective of how do we address the issue that we've got all these venues and spaces out there, and we are looking at repurposing, and I will go into some of the innovations later down this sort of discussion. But the big challenge that we had, and just yesterday I was in a meeting with PHE and the Minister, and my question is what was the threshold for you to make a decision to be able to allow bars, pubs and restaurants to open? Because if we understand that taking any action at all, that's 100% exposure, by putting mitigating measures in and drawing those down against what the pubs, bars and restaurants look like, we can then start to understand the modelling for reopening or safe reopening in terms of thresholds. And then we can look at that model across events, festivals, nightclubs, venues, whatever sort of premise there are. There are other challenges around that where the misconception is what type of spaces and venues do nightclubs or venues hold. So the big challenge that we have there also is education. Speaking to a professor that sits on the board for PHE and advises to the government, particularly the Cabinet Office, his understanding of a nightclub was a sweaty box. It was a venue where people were tightly packed together, where music was played loud, it was dim lights, etc. And I would not turn around and sort of sit here and say that some of them aren't, but there are so many different variations now. Since 2003 and the Licensing Act changing, there have been so many variations of types of spaces. The adaptations that have come from it, where we've got venues that have multi-purpose, multifaceted purposes, because with everything we have to evolve. Nightclubs have dropped in terms of numbers, but those hybrid spaces that have multi-purpose have grown massively. And there's a big project that we're doing with a statistical company at the moment to re-segment the nighttime economy in terms of the types of businesses that are out there. And part of that work is going to form an educational piece for informing PHE and government on exactly what types of businesses are out there, so that we can address it's not a one-size-fits-all environment. So leading from there, the big challenges that we're at the moment, and the sort of most up-to-date position that I can give you, is we are currently about to just take around PHE and ministers to lots of different types of nightclubs and venues, so that they can appreciate and understand exactly what's out there, and also understand the strength and depth of some of the people that are involved in this industry, as well as the secondary and tertiary purchase moments that possibly they don't realize will be fundamental in terms of the economic input for areas, particularly areas like Birmingham, which are so highly populated, and also the global impact in terms of that cultural position. Now, we have always been very, very keen to support a global perspective on what's going on in terms of dance floors and businesses that sort of equate to nighttime economy hours. And we are an active part of GMPR, which is something called Vibe Lab, which emanated from Berlin through a gentleman called Lutz and Mirik Milan, who are the old nightmares or night czars from Berlin and Amsterdam, respectively. And we've done a massive amount of work inputting our research and some of our work to lending to best practice and understanding some of the provisions and different methods that we can reopen doors. And as you can appreciate, there have been some quite left field ideas that have come about. But I think the interesting part here, and off a panel that I went to last week, is this belief that there is now, because of the digital impact that COVID has brought, there is going to be now a consistent position where COVID and the physical experience of a nighttime economy will absolutely sort of resonate and start driving forward. Now, what that has in terms of impact is going to be quite interesting. I mean, I've seen some huge innovation in terms of, I mean, recently we've seen a VAAR system, which is a two-way streaming system where a band can play on stage, can then tune in and listen to an audience, which will project their response via visual screens, which will surround the band in terms of an experience. Although it's not physical, they are talking about different experiences within sports, stadia, and also theatres. But they're also talking about integral methods of delivering food and drink to doors so that it almost enhances the experience of a tick box, move forward, you know, receive your goods early, then get involved in an event or a live performance. And they're still modeling and molding ways that that will sort of come together. But the next stage of that will be VR, as you can appreciate. And with the things like some of the gaming that's out there around music has definitely had huge influence. And I know Hayley, that's on this call at the moment, has been developing some ideas around gaming, and I've spoken to many gaming developers that are now starting to concede that there is a symbiosis between gaming and with you know, a nighttime economy, potentially that's going to inject some time into, or inject some pace into some of the youth culture getting involved at a much younger age without the alcohol side of things. So I think there's some exciting things happening. We have a massive task ahead of us, and I think that it's fantastic to have panels like this and research, and Pat and Lyle and everyone involved putting this together. It's been great to be sort of engaged and listen to some of the perspectives and the research that's being put together. The big challenge that we have ahead of us is time is not on our side. We're aware that some of the challenges around furlough, we're aware that the inputs for in terms of contribution in the next couple of months are going to present challenges for businesses that are not open or are beleaguered by the fact that they're not able to operate to a sustainable level to break even. The government are very keen on many platforms to look at an opening schedule for venues, nightclubs, and other spaces which represent. But the big thing that we've realised is, one, they don't understand our industry, and two, the agenda needs to be driven by us. And we're working hard at that agenda, and we need to keep people focused on sustainability and getting to a point that we can make sure that we can try and get to a point before the end of the year, so that we're not missing out on the seasonal contributions that take us through January and February. And I'm talking about freshers, I'm talking about Halloween, and I'm talking about the Christmas period. So I'm just going to leave you on one note, and quite an important thing that I delivered to the minister yesterday, and I was quite blunt with it, and I said to him, I am very aware that we need to push you to try and get the doors open. And as you quite rightly said, we want to get people back to work and we want to engage the economy. It has to be done safely. It has to be viable. And there has to be a proposition that's based on return business. There is no point in doing all this for people to come in and not enjoy the experience and not want to return, because the cultural implications of that are massive. And the last piece that I did say to the minister at the time, and I think this is quite important, no government is going to be known for the government that cancelled Christmas, particularly from the perspective of the country's well-being, from the perspective of the vitally important part that Christmas period plays in terms of economic stability. And to end a year where we're not going to be able to celebrate in one way or another will be quite devastating for this country. And the one thing that he noted was the fact that they're very keen to try and engage the market the best way that they can, in a fashion that is going to deter from them being that government. So I'm going to leave it there, because I think that's probably given you an overview of where we are and some of the challenges that we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. On this pessimistic note of Christmas potentially not, or being cancelled or not being cancelled. Let's move to another next speaker on the list, and we'll come back. I've noted a few questions to you. So let's move now to Adam Bear from the Newcastle University.
Okay, hi. I'm just going to say a few words about some of the background to the project that I'm running with Pat and with Craig, and he's going to build on that, and also about my own background and why someone from Newcastle University, who currently resides in Scotland, is on a research project looking at the West Midlands. So essentially, my own background in live music research, to cut a long story short, emerged from a broad-ranging project that looked at the history of live music in Great Britain post-war. And from that emerged an organization called the Live Music Exchange, which is where I came in. And the purpose of that was to try and build bridges between academic researchers, policymakers, and industry. There's quite a lot of that going on now, but it's easy to forget that, 10, 12 years ago, less so, particularly in the arts and humanities. And with Live Music Exchange, we engaged in several projects, which I won't go into a great detail about here. Some of which I will just mention looked at the cultural value of live music. We've been talking a lot today about the economic import of live music, which of course is vital, but that is tied up with its broader social and cultural value. But then also latterly, live music censuses locally in Edinburgh and then nationally, UK live music census with case study cities of Newcastle, Oxford and Glasgow. And some of the sort of the methods from that we're now deploying in the Midlands. And one key thing, pardon me, to emerge from all of that sort of underpins the work we're doing, and actually to sort of Michael covered some of this in his own talk helpfully, is the concept of the live music ecology. He talked about an ecosystem for nighttime industries. And what we mean by the live music ecology is, to an extent, interdependence of different types of venue, of different funding models, and of different groups of people with a stake in and an effect on live music in a given place. So perhaps at its most fundamental, just for instance, for a city to have a healthy live music ecology, there need to be operable, viable venues of different sizes, from your sort of 50 to 100 capacity pub room through the mid-range up to arenas, to provide progression routes for local musicians, to bring a decent mix of touring musicians into the city. And there's another aspect of this, is that a significant group of people that has a bearing on that live music ecology, who aren't on the face of it concerned, at least not directly in the first instance, with music making. So policymakers, councillors, licensing officers are a key factor in all of this. Promoters and venue owners often spend as much of their time concerned with their relationships with regulators and regulations as they do with agents, managers and musicians. Now, that has sometimes been framed as an oppositional relationship, but it certainly isn't always, and it certainly doesn't need to be. And the other side of that is funding initiatives and the like feed into it as well. But there's a complication in that policymaking exists in its own broader ecology as well. Local, regional, national, and in fact international intersect, as we are discovering in no small way with Brexit. And so while communication is a key issue, certainly at local level, this becomes harder to manage across those different levels. It's important to, I think one of the benefits that we found about research previously, and hopefully with this project, is to get local voices into the national conversation. So Brexit and COVID are two glaring current examples, but there are others from the, previously, which I'm going to mention briefly, just as an example of why responding to this research can be helpful. So planning, for instance, the agent of change principle, which I'm sure people are fairly familiar with here, that makes the person or business responsible for that change, responsible for managing it. This kind of long-standing problem that venues have had with developments near them, then leading to noise complaints, and another long-standing campaign to try and bring the agent of change in to mitigate that. Now, we recommended agent of change after the Edinburgh live music census, and it again was also a recommendation from the UK live music census, and the focus of lobbying, not least by people like the Music Venue Trust, UK Music. In Edinburgh in 2015, the local authority told us, well, no, that needs Scottish Government intervention. And then conversely, the national campaign started to bear fruit with Kevin Brennan's bill to introduce it. So there are all these sort of separate processes going on at Holyrood, Westminster, and locally. And much of the devil is in the detail, and I'm not going to go into it too much here, but complications abound. But it does show the value of local research and getting things onto the national agenda. The data that we produced from the UK live music census helped to drive, with local responses, helped to drive that national conversation, and also drove local changes as well. So in Edinburgh, and again, this was a long story, but there was a stipulation in licensing clauses that amplified music needed to be inaudible in neighboring premises. Now, as anyone that's spent any amount of time, in any premises, I can hear the traffic going outside my flat just now. That is audible. So that was sort of skewing the playing field against venues. And it was only really by actually getting the data and getting the responses of operators and musicians within the city that we managed to get that changed. Now, much of the work in our Birmingham project initially focused on Brexit. Our workshops last year demonstrated worries about a cultural pushback, a sense that Britain was becoming a less welcoming place. What would the effect of loss of free movement be on touring acts' willingness to hire crew from the area, as opposed to, let's say, Dublin? So that remains an overriding concern, and of course, COVID-19 as well. Music businesses in cities and towns exist in this interdependent relationship with one another, but also with those broader regulatory contexts. And local ecologies form part of that wider national ecology. So these are all, of course, current issues. But just to hark back to that bigger picture, part of the government's planned recovery program from COVID-19 was Project Speed, and the goal, as Prime Minister put it, to, quote, build, build, build. Now, where would that leave agent of change? It was obviously a concern. It took a written response from the Culture Minister to reassure that plans would, quote, also recognise the value of retaining buildings such as grassroots music venues and theatres, rather than encouraging their change of use. So part of what we need to do, I think, in this project and more generally, is not just to make sure that there's protection as regards the current situation, but also that we don't lose prior gains and that those prior gains don't come undone in the response. It's a fast moving situation, but national pandemic response and local cultural provision are intertwined. And so I'll just reiterate Pat's call from the beginning of the event. Feeding local voices into that national conversation is a challenge, but a vital step to take. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Adam, actually bringing in lots of information also from our local project in Birmingham. So that's kind of expanding further, and it links us really nicely to our final short speaker, Craig Hamilton, coming in to talk about our Birmingham live music map. I hope you didn't. Yeah, you're there. Awesome.
Hiya. Hi, everybody. So I'm working on the project with Pat and with Adam. I'm at Birmingham City University, and I was brought in by Pat onto the project because my main area of research interest is the role of data and digital technologies within the business and cultural environments of popular music. For those of you working in the music industries, I'm sure you're aware of how important those things are, and how data driven a lot of things are, even in the live music arena. So what I'm going to talk about in the next 5 minutes or so is one of the outputs of the Birmingham Live Music Project, which is the interactive map that Pat mentioned. I'll briefly show it you. I'll share my screen. For those of you that haven't seen it, you can have a quick look. But the idea behind the map essentially was partially coming out of the Brexit workshop that Adam mentioned, is that one of the things that in order to look at the Birmingham live music ecology and how it may respond to challenges such as Brexit or COVID, you need to understand what that ecology looks like. And we're all aware of venues like the Symphony Hall, the Hare and Hounds and things like that, but it's clear from anybody on the ground in the city that there are other types of venues that make up that ecology that may not be visible. So that could be open mic nights in pubs, people playing the piano in restaurants, what have you, people singing in church, all of that sort of stuff. They're all part of that ecology that Adam mentioned that give us the scene and the economy and the culture of live music in the city. So with my data hat on, we started to think about how we could potentially start to capture what that ecology is. That was the first thing. The second thing is, once you have gathered data about a particular thing, in this case the live ecology, and you have it kind of organized as data, then two things can happen really. The first thing is that you can bring in other data. So for example, once you have the postcode of a venue, you can start to pull in other data about the publicly available data, such as the average income of an area from the government, or the average house price in an area. So you can see how you can start to make a link between music venues and things like the agent of change principle that Adam mentioned, if you've got property prices and activity. But also you could bring in some other information from people on the ground that could be tied to this data, such as location. And when you also have things like latitude and longitude data of venues, which you need to plot them on a map, you can also then start to bring in other data. So for example, in the next version of the map, we'll have an option where you can show all of the bus stops in Birmingham and all of the train stations in Birmingham. Again, things like night buses, travel to venues are things that impact on the ability of venues to survive. And so from the policy point, or in the sense of our project being able to assist either local policymakers or local businesses when they're dealing with policymakers, providing them with a route to the kind of evidence that they might need to make those arguments is something we were thinking about with the map. And the final thing that we thought about with the map is, and again, this comes from kind of my approach to data focused projects, is can you make that process replicable, and can you make it easy for people to take that and use it elsewhere? And I think we've done a good job of achieving that, and that's kind of being evidenced by the fact that it looks like Liverpool are going to take the methodology and apply it there. We're hopefully going to do it with Glasgow as well. We're working with some researchers over in the Netherlands who may at a future point take it. So once you have data for different cities and it's organized in the same way, and you can then start to do comparative case studies, you're in a much better position then to start sharing some ideas around best practice more generally, or in this specific instance with COVID and the looming problem of Brexit, how music businesses within the live music ecology are responding to that. What are some of the ways that people are responding well and successfully? Can that information be shared? Can it be applied to other areas, and so on? So really, really quickly, I'm going to show you the map for those that haven't seen it. Let's see if I can share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. So the map, which Pat will share the link to, is very, very basically a map, as you can see. We've organised venues within a database by type. You can see on the right-hand side. Each dot on the map will provide menu information that's within the database. So one of those additional variables that I talked about, so altitude, obviously that doesn't tell us a great deal at the moment, but if you think about things like the parliamentary constituency, if you had the distance to the local train station and so on and so forth, that tells you a lot. That can potentially tell you a lot or help you make an argument about certain things. The data that's behind this map is also available in a sort of a pretty standard database form. Visitors to the map can kind of subset, take away different types of venues. And then one of the things, going back to my sort of first point about, well, what's visible within the music ecology is, well, most of the time it's those types of venues that are plugged in to certain industry mechanisms. So we were able to gather almost half of these venues from Songkick, which is a concert recommendation service, which I'm sure most of you are aware of. That gave us half of these venues, but half of the venues that you can see within this map, and if I scroll out to sort of the wider Birmingham area, you can see that the other ones, particularly those out in the sort of suburbs that are mostly pubs, they aren't plugged into things like Ticketmaster and things like that. So they're not visible in these kind of larger services. So we had a crowdsourcing element and a sort of a manual research element that gave us some of the others. So people using this map, you might live in Perry Bar or Highgate or Aston or somewhere like that, and you can see we don't have many venues there. People can come and they can add venues which will appear in later versions of the map. So what we're kind of hoping to achieve with this for Birmingham is that we can provide people like Lyle, who working with the Birmingham Music Coalition, Michael on a more sort of national level, with the ammunition they might need to make a case for certain things. But also through the surveys, we're trying to capture examples of best practice and additional data that we can tie to venues and we can tie to particular types of activity that then, if you imagine this map in a year's time when we've started working with Liverpool and there are dots all over this place rather than just in the middle, you can start to say, right, well, okay, well, if pub venues that are in suburbs within a particular distance from a train station and so on and so forth are doing certain things that are successful, they can then become case studies which could potentially apply to either other areas of the city or other areas of the country, Liverpool or Glasgow, or even other countries such as the Netherlands. So that's what we're trying to do with the map. Hopefully I haven't gone into too much boring technical detail, but being a bit of a data geek, I love to talk about that stuff. So if you are interested, either ask a question or feel free to contact me and we can talk in more detail about that. And I'll stop sharing my screen and hand back to Pat.
Okay, perfect, Craig. Just to kind of mention on that one, because Craig started talking about the map, one of the first things which we actually did with map, we applied different steps of the roadmap to recovery, which was originally proposed by the government in June, July. And one of the texts that actually we kind of published, linked to that one, indicated to us just by using our own map with different stages, how many venues can theoretically even open and start being active. So that was a quite shocking illustration of like, but a drop off from 98,000 people going outside partying on a good night, all the way down to only 1/3 of that capacity, and only at the final stages to recovery, so not even the early stages. But thank you very much to all the speakers, and I encourage everyone to start asking questions in order to kind of start up the debate between various speakers. I'm going to ask first question, and then we're going to start bringing those from the chat window. So don't forget to add questions there. So we talked, each of the speakers talked briefly about different activities that their organization or the projects are focused on, and what they're doing with regards to addressing current situation. And one of the very interesting things which Erica mentioned in her, her talk was a small-scale innovation. So how different places and organizations, theaters, but also venues are actually using those in order to kind of diversify their offers. I wanted just to ask if Erica could elaborate a bit more on the examples of those small-scale innovations.
Yeah. Put me on the spot there. So obviously you gave the example of the kind of hippodrome, but also I think it's about how you kind of put stuff on outside a little bit as well. There are some still quite challenges, so I'll go backwards. So we saw the RSC move their plays to their Dell outdoors and putting socially distanced hearts on the floor. We've seen collaborations with Compton Verney, which is obviously a large house in the south of the region, again commissioning work that's happening in their gardens to be able to attract people coming along. New Hampton Art Gallery, they are using their outdoor space for drive-in cinemas and different screenings as well. And we've seen partnerships between, again, more garden spaces and arts organisations. So Castle Hall Bromwich Gardens are working with a theatre company, well, they're working with the Court at Solihull. So one of the theatres there, they normally commission a piece of theatre and they are now commissioning that to go on in the garden, so there's kind of quite significant cross promotion there. There's lots of talk about how we can start to bring in technology as well and screens. How can we do those in local venues? How can we think about installations outdoors? Walking art maps came up in terms of how you can address things like the art and health agenda, and we've seen those happen as they're kind of little places around different parts of the city and town. I just saw today, instead of our kind of festivals in Stoke, that Stoke-on-Trent bid Business Improvement District, they've commissioned a number of kind of little art kind of activities. So they've got an exhibition at the moment, which is chairs in their high street that have been produced and created by artists. So I think it's just about seeing some things a little bit differently. I still think there are massive challenges around monetisation of some of that work as well, because normally, obviously, you kind of got ticket income. Outdoor arts is usually a non-ticketed activity. Certainly, your kind of festivals and high streets without a cost, because it's about highlighting space and things. And again, with digital, we haven't necessarily seen the innovations in kind of capturing money or monetising digital other than for donations, and I think that's an area for work for, I think, across the board. I know that the arena in Digbeth had also looked at potential collaborations around VR and ticketing that, and live music and live theatre performance as well. Don't know how much that's got off the ground yet, because I've not caught up with Ben for a while, but they're the sort of conversations that we can see. And I think but those are the things that we can start to do as we move forward anyway. So even as the restrictions with COVID lift, hopefully early in next year, those are the things that are actually really important for the sector to start thinking about as well, and just thinking again about more commercial collaborations like the warehouse and CBSO, for example.
Okay, thank you. Michael, you wanted to bring an example of one of the projects from actually outside of West Midlands. And he switched himself off. Right, so what, yeah. Michael, can you hear us again? Yeah? Yeah, it's the microphone again, sorry.
No. Oh, yeah. Sorry, what was that? Did I miss something?
Yeah, so basically you ask if you can bring an example of from Cardiff that could be worth discussing.
Yeah, no, so I was involved in a presentation in London where a company in Cardiff had worked collaboratively with the with placemaking, and what they were trying to do, and this was mainly formed around daytime, to be honest with you. But the key to this was what they were looking at is looking at all the green spaces and all of the adopted spaces owned by the local authority, and then trying to see if there was a way of maximizing the opportunity by displacing some of the licensed trade, whether it be eateries. And so they were trying to create an expansive space to increase the capacity or provision, and then be able to lift the proportion of or business levels to a point that people could actually make some money. So there were a lot of green spaces being used. There were a lot of, hard standing spaces being used. But the way that it works is they were trying to use businesses and their direct relationship with some of the spaces within Cardiff to expand the daytime proposition in terms of social engagement areas. And it was quite interesting. I mean, it wasn't a nighttime economy one by any way, shape or form, but it was quite interesting to see how that was sort of developing more than anything. And it's definitely something I can share with the group. But just to talk about this, one of the biggest challenges I have, and I'll sort of talk of Sarah Clover, who is an absolute supporter and an amazing sort of barrister in terms of planning and etc. and the agent of change position. One of the biggest challenges that we've had during COVID is getting regulators and particularly police to start acknowledging that they've got as big a part to play as we have as an industry to ensure that we can create opportunities. By being closed door and not be thinking expansively, create some barriers which are really unnecessary for us to try and develop the best position that we can find off the back of an unprecedented position that no one expected, no one, knows the future of at the moment. Probably 6 months ago, when we were all sat around the table and saying, look, this is not going to happen to us. We can see this happening all around the world. And I remember building, presentations and speaker pieces about it. But the fact of the matter is there is a lot of work that needs to go on with regulators and police to start to understand that for us to get past this and for businesses to survive, there's several things that need to happen. We need to have a roadmap and understand what's happening. We need to have some sort of provisional support, but we need some collaborative work with local authorities and police and regulators to try and think a little bit outside of the box. And I think you'll find that there is such a disparity between some of the regulators out there in terms of not only the interpretation of guidelines, but that honed absolute vision of what can be done and can't be done, which hinders creativity. It hinders people trying to, and at some point people will stop trying, which is the sad bit. And that's when this best practice is not going to envelope across the country and change the format for the UK. Because if we actually stem through regulation and stop licenses and stop use of spaces, then people are going to stop trying and other people are not going to hear about it and try to do it. Hence the Cardiff thing being quite interesting. But we've got to start from those decision makers, and that's an education piece, which is a lot bigger conversation, but it is a starting point, and I think it's important.
Yeah, I fully agree about the education of the policymakers. Sometimes it's just simple things as just explaining to them how the venues are organized, and very often something which we meet with in the project, the people we talk with, they imagine the venue as simple squared space, and they don't take in consideration, sometimes it's just L-shaped, sometimes it's a lower level, different entrances and so on. So it's really kind of showing to the policymakers how it looks in reality in a way. But I have a few more new questions coming in. So one very simple one, so I can cover that one, is a question about the map itself. It's currently live and available. The version 3.0 we hope will be ready in October, mid-October, before another workshop. So hopefully we'll be able to add some information. Right, I have a elaborate question from Lyle. So I would like to ask him to pop in on camera and put his microphone on, so he can ask the question directly to our panelist.
Oh, is that because it was such a long question you wanted me to humiliate myself by asking it?
Of course.
Okay. All right. So, So yeah, to the panel, throwing it out to all. So the economic value of the city region's live music sector is by now well documented and reported. I would suggest that the artistic and social value of contemporary and commercial live music has been and still is under-recognised and under-reported by cultural, political and business leaders at both regional and national level. A lot of music industry professionals feel that contemporary and commercial live music sits at the bottom of the arts and culture hierarchy, and a lot of what we've seen from local and central government in terms of the financial response and all the rhetoric around the situation, it kind of appears to confirm that theory. So it's a dual question. Does the panel agree with that? And aside from that, how might the live sector position itself as equal to some of the other arts and culture areas over the coming months, years and decades, at least in Birmingham and the Midlands?
Okay, thank you so much. I would like to ask Adam to start that conversation, as that linking to his experiences also in other projects.
Yeah, to take the first part of that, do I agree? Yes. That was the easy bit. How do we? Well, yes, but also I think the situation in terms of the sort of recognition of the cultural and social value of live music is ahead of where it was 10 years ago. We're not where we would ideally like to be yet, but you know, if you look at I don't know, Hansard, for instance, you know, there is still an emphasis on, you know, the 1.1 billion and the economic contribution, but there is some there is a growing recognition, albeit too slowly. What do we do about that? Is the trickier bit. I think without wanting to collapse too much into sort of theoretical chat, the case can be made that for instrumental value, i.e. music, live music is worth X billion to the economy, versus intrinsic value. It just, you know, it is in and of itself a social and cultural good. And if you're trying to sort of put across that kind of intrinsic value, that art for the sake of art and all of that kind of really sort of complex stuff, you quite quickly end up having to sort of split the cultural atom, which is not something that that works very well when you've, you know, got a minister who's got, you know, 10 minutes to look over a brief, or a councillor who's got hospitals and roads and schools and all the rest of it on their to-do list. But I think the thing to remember is that instrumental value, things that they can understand, isn't just economic value. So to sort of follow the example slightly of taking things from elsewhere, health, for instance, has, you know, over previous decades managed to present itself in a way that regulators and policymakers can understand without recourse just to money. So, for instance, quality adjusted life years. The difficult bit, but the thing that is possibly achievable, is to present the value, the cultural value of live music in a way that, you know, bluntly the Treasury or whoever can understand, without collapsing just back into only numbers. How we do that is qualitative research as well as quantitative, but also to include qualitative type questions on the surveys that, you know, so if you can show, I'm just trying to think of a specific example from one of the ones that we did. Well, okay, I'll take Edinburgh. I can't recall the exact numbers in my head, but we showed something like 40-something% of musicians had been affected by a clause in licensing, and that this was impacting on their ability to work as musicians. And then from that, we could show that this was removing a particular particular types of music, basically anything that had a drum kit upwards. So not just rock or metal, but, you know, folk, jazz, whatever. And you could make that case then in terms of cultural provision, and to take I think it was Erica's point at the beginning about how do you make space, how do you make things more inclusive. If you can say, well, look, all these other types of music, all these types of music are suffering because of this particular clause in the licensing, that's not inclusive. That works against inclusivity. So to make two sort of specific, but also perhaps unhelpfully very broad points, is more qualitative research, so that you can actually hook those numbers onto a narrative and a story that people can grasp. You know, regulators and ministers, and, you know, they like big numbers. This is how much music's worth. This is how much contribution it makes to the economy. But they also need to be able to tell a story. So we can give them that story, but we can also bring those more kind of ephemeral valued things by choosing to ask, as well as questions of, you know, how many gigs did you play last year? How many, you know, how much money did you make? What did this venue mean to you? How did this venue impact on your life? And if we get enough responses, then we can show that a significant proportion of people will find that the Leith Depot, as well as the Usher Hall, provides value to the area. That's quite a long-winded answer, but hopefully it goes some way.
It does, and a lot of that is familiar, and you know, much of it is about human interest and the emotive angle, because we know that the stats are out there, and organisations like UK Music do a very good job at making them stick, but it doesn't seem to have shifted policy or changed the perception or the intrinsic value of culture, certainly at a regional level, or at least music's place within that. Sorry, live music's place within that.
Okay, I would like Michael now to kind of weigh in onto the discussion, like, and just to repeat the question from Lai, how might the industry position itself as an equal to publicly subsidized arts and culture in current situation?
I'll try and sort of sum this up really sort of quickly. Value is a massive part of it. We are, when you compare us to different parts of the world, music, whether it be live music, nighttime economy, festivals, the value perception is much greater. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we have, and I'll sum this up in a quote that I got from a senior minister when I asked him about, does he understand the value of dance music? And he said to me, yes, you can still do, dance troupes are still able to do what they need to do, and you can still do music recitals. So as you can understand, if that's a senior cabinet minister trying to interpret, as I would say, something that was vitally important in terms of contemporary music, I think we've got a massive education process that we need to go through. And I think that's going to be an evolution of politics before we get to that stage. So the value is really important. The education is fundamentally important. And that cycle of political minds that is actually going to engage and start to understand the cultural implications is a massive part of it. And we need to start digging down into the detail. We're doing a massive project at the moment, which is looking at the perception and the decision-making around licenses and their cultural implications around those decision-making, so that we can tally up the musical genre with the decision-making process. If we can subjectively find a way of tying up the decision-making process in terms of people, key stakeholders and key decision-makers making decisions based on culture and music, similar to some of the examples where we've seen Afrobeat sessions in London being knocked back and being said that they're crime generators, we're not going to get past that until we start educating from the top down. That's about cultural education, that's about value of culture, music, in whatever guise it comes forward. We have to get to a point and we have to start to engage in that cycle, because it is going to be a 5 to 10 year cycle to actually eradicate this very lack of knowledge in terms of music, education. I mean, look, it's a massive part of education. I sit back and it astounds me. And I was writing a piece the other day, and it's the last sort of final piece before I go. If you looked at dance music culture, whether you look at live music, people go back in time to listen to different types of music from different eras, whether it be jazz, funk, whatever it is, to steal pieces, you know, listen to small different riffs or different parts. It's almost like reading a book, but in terms of music, it's massive. And I just don't think particular government mindset is around understanding the importance, both well-being wise, educationally, and in terms of value for the UK. And we've got to start that journey, and it's got to start from the right people at the top and move its way down and start looking at local authorities and start looking at key decision makers. And as we've said many times before, some of the key decision makers there are not at an appropriate age to understand all levels of culture. And I think that's disproportionately allowed in environments where decisions are being made against youth culture. We need to start having a broader age range of people making decisions about culture that are well informed, and they can make exact decisions through relevant experience, so that we can start evolving what we're doing politically across the UK.
Thank you, Michael. That was actually very useful, kind of bringing back the debate on the focus on the education aspect. I have one question coming in from Simon Patton, actually interesting enough, bringing us back to the debate, leaving the venues itself and rather focusing on touring in post-COVID period. So Simon, could you ask the question?
Yeah, sure thing. So the reason why I wanted to kind of like talk is because like for the people that are on this panel that know me, they know how much I like just rambling on. So it's going to be one of those sort of questions. But it's weird because sort of at the moment, I'm kind of being like a very much kind of an advocate for keeping things as regional as possible. Support with like creating music and putting on gigs. So like this real emphasis for like just booking local acts, all the collaborations that are all locally. But there will come a point, probably very soon, where we're all going to be like, we need to go on tour again. And I've kind of started thinking about how this could possibly look, because when people try and go on tour again, you know, anyone that's been on tour knows that it's super common to get sick on the road, and usually what happens is at least before the pandemic, it would be like you just kind of slug it out and be a road warrior. That was the kind of the mentality, and now I don't think we really kind of have that option post COVID. You know, someone will get sick of like on like day 3 of a 10-day tour, and would kind of, and would mean that in the interest of safety, they have to cancel the whole thing, which would mean, you know, if it's a paid tour, a loss of work not only themselves, but possibly a whole band, if they're a larger act as well, the crew as well, etc., etc. So I've been like trying to think of all these like ways that we can kind of satisfy this urge to go on tour and like the urge to travel, but how we can kind of do it in a way that kind of minimizes the risks. And a way I kind of came up with was this idea of the was kind of re-establishing the artist residency. I wrote a post on my Facebook about this, and it was quite well received by a lot of musicians. So this idea of kind of having like one artist going to a town or a city, and instead of like going from town to town to town to town, they just spend 2 weeks to a month in that city or that area and play like a whole series of gigs. They can put all their music in different contexts. My own kind of background comes from like experimental music, so there's kind of like a real emphasis on collaboration. So there'll be like all these opportunities to collaborate with local musicians, could maybe even be commissioned to write music that's only to be played in that particular city. All of these doing things like workshops and guest lectures as well. So all these kind of possibilities for how all these kind of possibilities for what you could kind of do in this sort of period. What some of you might know Corey Mwamba, and he was sort of saying that this was like a regular thing that jazz musicians used to do in the US in the 50s, and he's tried it a few times. I wanted to do a version with an Estonian sax player before the pandemic hit as well. Another friend of mine is said he's basically already doing this at the moment. He started doing it around the summer. So I guess to kind of bring back just to kind of like feed that as a possible idea of what touring could look like. And I guess to the panel, what other ideas are you thinking about for what touring could look like post-pandemic, and especially in a physical space as well?
Thank you, Simon. That was very interesting kind of introduction to also one of my own questions, kind of following on that one. Some of the discussions that Cautious and Creative Culture had within the panel, so I'm going to like look at Erica here, was involved with some of the examples and initiatives were actually very localized touring. So kind of instead of doing traditional tour between larger cities, doing it on a very small scale. So maybe I'll ask Erica to kind of step in here and maybe talk about some of the examples and experiences of response unit with that regard.
With regard, sorry, with regards to smaller touring type of things. You've put me on the spot now because I can't actually think about what you experienced. I just to drop back and know this just a previous step though, about the question of music within the kind of wider cultural sector, and I just wonder, there's something that I'd be interested to kind of look at. I think there's something around that subsidised, non-subsidised sector that kind of gets missed, and the language around that, and yeah, so just as an aside from anybody who would be interested in a conversation from a cultural perspective, I'm happy to host a meeting kind of around the music kind of sector in the region to try and have some of those conversations as part of our cultural response unit work, if that's useful. That's kind of a bit, and I know those networks happen, but how we can tie them in to the wider sector and the messaging that's going back that we're doing in terms of local authorities and the combined authority, etc. Although the most of the argument that they want at the moment is economic, but we also know that, and I think that's why we go down that route. In terms of smaller scale touring, I think there is, I'm trying to kind of think about now is maybe it's worth kind of having a look at maybe some of the outdoor arts models around the smaller touring, because they are looking at how they can do those things. and holding people in bubbles and things like that in those different spaces. So there is that, but yeah, I probably don't remember what we were talking about. Sorry about that, Patricia. There's a lot going on in my head sometimes.
No, not a problem at all. I was just thinking about some of the examples when theatre troupes actually travel between social clubs and really small scale. So the risk of like spreading around the potential infection is slightly decreased, and potentially the social clubs, because of the way how they're organized, are slightly different to typical live music venue. I have Michael who would like to come in to join the discussion on that one.
Hi, Simon. I mean, look, there's massive challenges. We sit in on some meetings with Live Nation. We sit in with some independent promoters. The challenge you have always, and it's a battle. I mean, I was in a meeting yesterday with the working group for DCMS. There are some pilot schemes going on at the moment to try and expand on the position, but with the rule of six, it's kind of quashed some of the ways that can happen. As I alluded to before, I mean, everyone wants to get the doors open. Everyone wants to get touring moving. I sat on an international panel a couple of weeks ago, and we're talking to the likes of CAA and Decked Out and some of the bigger other sort of festival promoters who are looking at hard ticket sales not happening until the end of next year. I know Jeff Ellis and people like that in Glasgow talking about that, you know, they're not looking at getting any sales on in terms of gigs until March. I know about 2 months ago they were talking about smaller gigs, but the challenges were around managing singing and wind instruments in particular. And there's a big discussion on how that works. When we first engaged with that with DCMS, they wanted a 6 metre social distancing rule. It's now been reduced to 3 metre, but if you're in a sort of small live venue and you've only got 50 to 100 cap, with those sort of social distancing measures, you're talking about sort of 15, 20 people seated, you know, there are challenges. So the viability issue is one of those biggest things in terms of indoors. Outdoors, obviously there's a greater opportunity, but you're still talking about quite cavernous spaces. So I think it's a massive balance. Touring, without a doubt, people want to get musicians involved. They've looked at different ways of doing it technically in terms of the digital platforms, but I don't think anyone's going to get away from live music being something that has to be physically experienced, and that noise and sound and vibration and all the bits that go along with that sort of culture. The challenge that we have is balancing up the ability to put it on in a safe in a safe environment against viability. Not so much experience-wise, it's a little bit easier to rekindle some sort of experience of people listening to music, whether it's sedentary or whether it's, you know, something which is responsive. The challenge you have is viability for a lot of people, and you've seen many gigs that have been put on, and since the rule of six, they've dropped out. So the government have almost led us to a point that they want us to engage, and they want these things to happen, and they want to engage musicians, and they want people to start engaging in music, but they've not really given us a platform in terms of social distancing measures and viable proposition in terms of space management to be able to try and attempt to get to a point that it's a workable practice. And that's the challenge with it is, you know, and everyone out there doesn't want to, and you know, you see the lockdowns, everyone doesn't want to put a shed load of money into getting gigs on and getting artists in and getting musicians ready for it to be pulled. I mean, I've heard of 2 or 3 festivals being pulled this weekend. And you imagine you put your heart and soul into it, you spend, you know, 3 months promoting it or whatever you've been doing, and that's pulled from underneath you. It's thousands of pounds. And given the insurance position at the moment, and I've recently seen a big document that's relevant to insurers and government guaranteeing insurance so that there might be light at the end of the tunnel. It's a real challenging environment, and we haven't crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's in terms of business exposure. So only at that point, I believe that we're going to be able to start embarking, although there have been discussions, given that what's gone on at the moment, about social distancing being reviewed in November. Does that help you?
Yeah, thank you. I have now Craig, who would like to bring in a bit, few points to the discussion actually linked to that question, relates to innovation and building different models. So Craig, if you
Yeah, it's two things, and hopefully they're positive, or there might be pie in the sky, but they're positive. But I think that currently the touring model, as Michael has just outlined, is a square peg in a round hole with COVID. You know, we're not going to be back to a situation where there will be 300 people in the upstairs room of the Hare and Hounds at any point soon. So there is an opportunity, I think, to rethink different things, and it's worth remembering that, you know, the whole way that we do things now is not a naturally occurring phenomena. It's just something that we've done for a long way, but they themselves arose out of social other types of social change. You know, we have national booking agents and we have venues because they emerged out of things like vaudeville and the music hall, which themselves emerged out of people moving towards cities in the Industrial Revolution, right? So it's just so happens that we've stayed with that model for a long time. Now, the hope would be that there is some 15-year-old kid in his or her bedroom somewhere in the world who is currently developing something that in 3 years' time we're all going to go, I wish I'd have thought of that, or, you know, why haven't we always done it that way? Okay, so that's a possibility, and I think we will see certain types of innovation with tech that's already available and some tech that isn't available. And I think the other kind of positive point, or potentially positive point to make on things changing with the way that we currently do things, is that the way that we currently do things isn't exactly ideal for all people anyway, you know, and that goes right the way from, you know, the work that Sarah Rain did at Birmingham City University around female musicians. You know, you look at festival lineups and it's mostly male bands, all the way down to grassroots levels where bands will, you know, travel 150 miles for 50 quid. And that's just the way we do things. So you're only getting 50 quid, right? So although everything has stopped and everything is in chaos, there is an opportunity to build things in perhaps a more equitable way and in more technologically interesting ways. That's my point.
Okay, so very big call towards the innovation and coming up with new solutions. I have another question coming in. It's not only about the challenges and barriers, but like, how can we actually ensure a thriving nighttime economy, creative culture, and sustainability of live music ecology? And the question came in mostly from the fact that, like, some of our own research, but also produced, for example, by Indigo, showed that when doing audience surveys, audiences, or like gig goers, but also theater goers and so on, they're very keen on return to the events. But how can we help with actually creating the atmosphere, or what could be a good solution in order for people to start actually attending potential events coming in the future? Some other statistics which we have also from the project is, when we asked our interviewees, if they have actually currently some tickets for cancelled venues, for cancelled events, are they intending to keep it and attend it on later date? 81% of them said, yes, we have tickets for events which were cancelled, but we're going to actually try to participate in those. So there's a willingness of people to actually participate in the events, in the nighttime economy, theater, music, going to the restaurant. So what can we do? What can be advised in order to kind of improve those numbers and kind of keeping up with the people who actually want to still go and do things? So I'll ask that to Adam, maybe as a first person.
Well, to small threads back to Kyle's question, and also I think Erica's point in response to that about the subsidized and the unsubsidized sector. Like it or not, in the short term, it's going to require some level, a minimum level of government support. You know, if you want to have this infrastructure of some sort to come back to, given the hiatus, then you need to sort of recognise that most of these are small to medium enterprises, or indeed, you know, sole traders of you know, whatever level. And I know that, you know, there are umpteen calls on the public purse at the moment. I forget the name of the economist who said basically everyone's a Keynesian in a foxhole, and people that, you know, we're all about private enterprise, you know, whether it be, you know, Virgin Airways or you know, every single industry at the moment is, you know, that were sort of market red in tooth and claw up to February are now like, no, we must have government support. But actually, the culture sector has been making that case for quite a lot longer. And it's a bit of an obvious point, but it stands. I think also in the short term, to pick up Michael's point about education, with which I entirely agree, although I do think, you know, it is a process of evolution. It has taken a long time to even get to where we are now. But another thing that the sector can do sort of more imminently in terms of education is to get the message across to government that their communications need to be better. Because, you know, the rule of 6, and then, you know, well, can you go, is it 6? How many bubbles? How many households? You know, does it, well, what if I'm carrying a shotgun and I'm going to shoot a grouse on the way? All these, you know, that uncertainty is a brake on people attending. I think like a case in point was at the beginning of the, you know, the lockdown was don't go to the pubs, don't go to pubs, but pubs aren't, we're not going to make them shut for another week. Well, how does that work? So I think that just some clarity of communication from the top down, and that message needs to come from us to them saying, look, you cannot expect the sector to communicate effectively with audiences or potential audiences or audiences on pause unless they know exactly what the situation is. And that's a, you know, compared to extending the furlough scheme or underwriting venues that have to shut or have to curtail their activity, that's a comparatively low cost action, but one that needs to happen.
That's a very good point. And we have also, Michael added also the point about the premise for engagement, following on that one. Erica, how actually the creative culture sector is dealing with aspects of encouraging audience and gig goers, theatre goers to actually re-engage with the venues?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges, especially if you think about venue-based audiences. They are often in the most vulnerable places as well. Certainly, they kind of, when you think about things like ballet, CBSO, etc., you know, you're looking at quite a different demographic. So I think there's some work to do around changing that demographic a little bit. Well, I think the research that we've done with audiences about how they feel safe, most of them do, like you're saying, there is a big desire to come back to venues. How do you pivot and do what you do as a sector to be able to think about how you do something differently that makes people safe in a space, but that's economically viable? And I think that's the massive challenge that we've talked about. So we're currently just doing some advocacy for the government, obviously comprehensive spending review, which is around that long-term sustained investment for the sector that looks at how you can start to rebuild, but how you can think about it differently and how there are sustained approaches. But we need that investment, and I think things like, you know, expansion or some kind of support scheme where venues are not able to open is an advocacy. But it's about, you know, if we look at a sector, we are already before all of this was already underfunded, undersupported in so many different ways anyway. So how do we kind of make that case? So definitely agree with the advocacy, but I think there's also some scope in that collaboration. I don't think, you know, I've definitely seen, as far as the sector in the West Midlands, collaborate much more strongly, but I think that cross-sector, across commercial, subsidised, and nighttime economy needs to be built much more strongly as well, so that the messaging is consistent across all of those pieces about safety and about confidence, and that public confidence campaign to encourage people to come back in a safe way. And also, how do you kind of create that? I know it's been in the Next Start group as well, Michael, you know, that how do you provide that sense of social responsibility for people to do the things that you're asking them to do in those environments, which is why I think live music struggles, is because they don't, that perception of not being able to trust people to be in those bubbles that are there. For example, you know, it's easy when you think about sitting in a theatre, for example, about staying in one space. And I think we have to kind of just get that messaging right around that for audiences, because the design, you know, everyone's been holed up for 6 months, and we can see that's what's increasing things, that people want to be out, want to be doing things. How do we collaborate between those sectors to encourage people to come safely into those spaces? Maybe it's just about people seeing those spaces safely in small ways to start off with, and I don't know if that's an innovation, you know, putting one person on with a small number of people, so people are getting used to that sense and what the restrictions might be, and what the markings on the floor might be about holding those groups, and the confidence that you know what you're doing, then putting that into licensing and local government as well as audiences.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, and also take people from a theatre to a live music venue for a proper night out. Do you know what I mean? How do you go from dinner, theatre to live music? You know, those are other things you could start to think about, because maybe there's a through line with what's happening.
Well, I'll definitely keep fingers crossed, because it's a very interesting option to think about the whole evening, not just like an hour or so. Actually, I want to kind of look now a bit on the hopefully a bit more optimistic picture. So we talked about a lot of challenges and barriers and problems which are coming up. And I was wondering more about what new opportunities the current situation actually gave to our different subsectors in that sense. And I have some examples. So when we were researching the topic in the project, looking at the map at various venues, but also coming up from the surveys, there's a lot of things going on, like musicians, for example, on one side going online, doing a lot of local venues are doing these sessions, streaming them online. There's also quite interesting trends, so especially at the initial stages of crowdsourcing venues who changed sometimes their specialization. So instead of having live events, they started doing also food, or simply unusually starting producing merchandise, which they didn't before. So there are some interesting examples, including also like when we had the furlough schemes or self-employed schemes, which are now running out. But in contrast, there are things organized, like, for example, by Live Nation, supporting the staff that worked on the event before. So now the question is to the panelists looking to the future, some optimistic message in the sense of kind of looking at the opportunities that current situation created. So I'll ask maybe Michael to start on that one.
Thanks, Patricia. I think the one thing that I am without a doubt confident in is the strength and depth of the entrepreneurial spirit that we hold within our industry, whether it be live, festivals, etc. Even down to it, and dare I say it, the illegal parties that are happening in the background. While we all sit around and sort of frown at the fact that it could transpire to be something that is not helping in terms of transmission, most of these festivals that are here now, that are globally recognized, were born from those parties and those events and that bohemian sort of background that they came from. And that was also born in the late 80s from governments ensuring that licenses didn't go past 1 o'clock in the morning. I think if most people remember, I'm sorry if I'm too old, but this was really about limitations on licenses and people not having enough of the nighttime economy or wanting to go out nighttime experience wise, and finding events which ended up being illegal raves, which is where the likes of some of the biggest DJs from this country have come from. So given those sort of innovations and the fact that we are sat on a multi-billion-pound festival industry, which is globally recognized, which in some respects was born from innovations around restrictions by government, but people not being restrained by cultural sort of representation and not being able to go and express themselves, I always believe that there is going to be a positive out of this situation. There are lots of things going on at the moment, whether you're driving cinemas, whether you're driving gigs, whether you're, gigs in Newcastle that we've seen, we'll continue to evolve that. I mean, the digital preface for this is still being explored. VR has got to take a practical piece within what's going on at the moment. I know from a student-based perspective, because I was worked for the student union at University of East Anglia for several years as the commercial director there. I was very aware of them looking at expansive methods of developing experiences for students in particular. So I'm confident that we have got some of the best creatives in the world working along and around us. And given the fact that over the last sort of 20 plus years, well, 30 plus years, we have now created an environment and an ecology which involves festivals which are out of this world, like Glastonbury and Boomtown, etc. I know we're going to come out the other end with some special experiences which are going to come off the back of such hardships, such difficult times. So without wanting to sort of highlight some of the things that are out there, and I'm sure most people will understand most of the things that I've seen, from comedy outdoors to utilising outdoor spaces, terraces. It's as much about repurposing and pivoting as it is about finding new ways of doing things in a more sedentary environment. So I think the key thing here is the positivity comes off the back of the strength and depth that we have within our industry. And I can see 2021 being very innovative. But I just wanted people to remember the past and the fact that that past has curated a future globally that we're world renowned for. And I'll just end on that. I think that's an important thing to recognise and remember. And remember, 2020 has been a challenge, but 2021, I believe, is going to be quite an innovation period for UK culture across the board.
We should totally start new hashtag 2021, new innovation in music industry. One of the people coming in, so Michael, don't go yet. One of the people actually asked a follow-up question. So you made interesting point about the engagement by seeking a premise to engage. Could you elaborate a bit more on that?
Sure. I mean, I sit on GMPR, which takes into account all the different major cities around the world. And we sit and talk about the best way to start to sort of move forward or get to a point where not only the public have confidence, but also the industry and the government have confidence, and we engage and move things forward. And some of the key sort of economic sort of powers around the world, the likes of Tokyo, Australia, New Zealand, all are talking about, listen, let's engage small and start to grow, gain confidence in public perception, gain confidence in political perceptions, and then we can grow from there once we've identified ways that we can mould and move forward. The big thing that I think that's happened that the UK government doesn't do very well is recognising starting small and growing, but still having the ability to be able to present an experience. The big thing that a lot of these governments outside of the UK have done has they've actually created a dynamic for people to attempt to open and fulfill some of that economic shortfall. So for instance, New Zealand do something where they accepted that most venues would only be able to open at 40% of capacity under social distancing. And there've been some quite erratic sort of social distancing measures, both in Australia and New Zealand. So what they did is, over a period of 4 months, each month, they subsequently made up the shortfall in terms of revenue for these businesses. So if it started at 40%, the expectation within the next month would be to go to 50%, then 60, then 70, and then they would let them go because they felt that that was the position where they would break even, and they weren't there to really allow them to make money off the back of that subsidy. So there was a very clear, concise understanding that they needed to engage safely. And as the capacity of the business was allowed to grow, they reduced the amount of subsidy or support out there to be able to allow them to engage in the marketplace effectively. So those sort of models I think are quite interesting, but everyone within the world is very keen to understand we've got to engage, we've got to get to a point where we've got to show a way forward, both for politicians to understand, as you've heard earlier, senior ministers completely missing the point in terms of live music, electronic music, etc. So there's a big education, and we're asking these people in central government that just don't identify with what we are, and we're asking them to learn in a very short period of time of exactly what we're making, you know, what we've learned in years. So you know, and that's not an excuse for them. They should know anyway. If you're the head of DCMS or the head of, you know, the government, you should start understanding what the UK is made up of, particularly culturally. So what I'm saying is engagement is key, but we need a method of engagement which is going to encourage people to do it safely, but not compromise them financially, which is where the challenge lies at the moment. And many examples across the world have done it, and we've presented some of those to government, but it's not something that they want to take up because they feel they can't control it, which is where the challenge lies.
Okay, thank you so much. It was actually a very useful explanation. Craig, could you actually come up on some of the opportunities that we can potentially see in the future?
Well, I think Michael's absolutely correct. You know, we've got an incredible baseline of creativity and entrepreneurial spirit in the creative sector in the UK, and how those people respond is going to be the lead that people will follow. But I think another potential positive or something to consider in terms of how we rebuild or we move on is the wider social changes. So, you know, one thing that has been proven beyond doubt this year is that a lot of people can do their jobs at home with plants behind their head, you know, rather than having to go into an office. And I think, you know, you read a lot of articles and this was behind the government getting everybody back into cities because cities are going to die. Well, you know, if people move out of cities and into more local neighbourhoods, then maybe that's when the activity goes. You know, the sandwich shops move from the city to the local neighbourhoods and so on and so forth, and maybe some of the music and cultural activity does as well. So keeping an eye on how things shift from the city to the local is going to be interesting, and also if, as some people are predicting, if companies are going to vacate spaces that are in city centres, then as you see with areas like Digbeth and stuff like that, if a place becomes vacant and cheap, then a lot of interesting stuff starts to happen there. So I guess I'm trying to bring up a potential positive for the sort of the medium to long term is that, you know, people are always going to want to make music. People are always going to want to listen to music, as Michael and Adam said, and so they will move into those spaces that the wider social changes create. Is what I think will happen, and that's probably worth keeping an eye on. And if you're an entrepreneur or a creative person looking to develop your business or a new business or help your existing one survive, then it's keeping an eye on those wider social changes that might give you the clues.
Okay, thank you. It's a really interesting point, kind of looking in the direction of bringing together Michael's points and Craig about, on one side, having this fantastically creative sector and kind of simply saying, well, we need a permit from the governmental authorities to actually really be creative, providing some of the solutions. And maybe kind of to wrap up some of the questions and debates and the points, some of the opportunities that we observed in Birmingham. So Craig already talked about them a bit. But something which we kind of struggle a bit with is actually finding very positive cases and kind of looking at the situations when, like, for example, Michael mentioned a lot of work coming into preparation of festival event and then a rapid change of the policy and a lot of festivals had to be cancelled. So some of the examples actually from this weekend is the Swingamagic Park party, which unfortunately due to the new restriction had to be cancelled. So, but they're like, we're trying to find more positive examples. So kind of last positive examples from Erica, if something comes to mind as like this situation created certain opportunities that we can actually use as example of positive development.
I'm a bit of a fan of, and I've talked about it far too much in this one. So I think the positive things is about the collaboration and the cross-sector working as we move forward. I think we've seen from COVID and potentially from Brexit a kind of a real sense of joint need, but also kind of drive forward and an understanding of that it's a wider sector and that we need to kind of have one collaborative, strong voice that makes those arguments and that kind of has that clear messaging specific. I mean, I'm talking about a region and actually obviously I'm in the West Midlands and I want to talk and shout about the West Midlands, but also what's the narrative for our region and how do we shout really loudly and put ourselves on that world stage. And I think those are real opportunities that we've had as part of that, how to do things differently, showing how we're doing things differently and actually shout about it and being instead of being so self-deprecating.
Oh, okay. I have final word actually coming from Simon Easton, who is just waving to me, raising his hand. So hopefully he can ask the question easily.
Yeah, hi guys, and apologies for joining late. Really interesting to listen to people and some of the comments. I'll just echo what Craig was saying earlier, which is in essence that necessity is a mother of invention, and that hopefully we'll see some positives coming out of this current situation. And I also agree with Michael that live is king. I've just paid for my son to go to Reading Festival next year, so you know we want to think about coming out of this situation rather than just continue what we can do about it, which I know is important. I think one of the positives for me, again using my children as an example, is that they're rediscovering past music that they may not have done if they hadn't been sort of locked down, as it were, and rediscovering other genres of music, which I think is really positive. And again, that may well lead, hopefully, to sort of further creativity and development of their own styles going forward. But on a more practical level, as Erica knows, in this region, we're lucky that we've got the Commonwealth Games coming up. There's a funding for a cultural programme and therefore opportunities for music and live music in that. And also before that, the Coventry City of Culture, of course, although not starting until May, is going to be a really big programme of arts, cultural activity, hopefully involving music and live music. And then, of course, you guys hopefully have known that the announcement has been made about the UK Festival of Culture 2022, which is countrywide and involves major projects, but it's 120 million quid's worth of investment into cultural activity in 2022 that will also help feed in opportunities for performance and activity, and hopefully a lot of that is around live music. I just wanted to make the point though, and forgive me for missing the first hour, I was committed to something else, that we need to treat this situation as a hiatus, and that obviously come a vaccine, which is what we all need to address our situation, we shouldn't forget the challenges that we were already facing in the sector that will need to be addressed as we come out of this from under this dark cloud. And I'm talking about things like licensing, things about venue closures, things about providing more open spaces, Brexit, the movement of artists across borders, and looking at social cohesion and engaging with other cultures and expressing ourselves and interests through other music. I just wanted to make that point in terms of we need to think about the future and coming out of this hiatus. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll ask Adam to kind of put in the last point with regard to his hopefully optimistic view on the future and the opportunities that this new situation is bringing to the creative culture.
I think a lot of it's been covered. Certainly the entrepreneurialism and the sort of innovative spirit. And just to, I mean, Craig mentioned that, but just another, at the moment, we're sort of thinking about things that are happening that are obvious to us. But, we're talking about, Craig was talking about the sort of 15-year-olds now, the people that are going to be active in 2 years' time, 3 years' time. if we're thinking purely in terms of you know, license trade, but even beyond that, things are unpredictable, and this is a bit of an older anecdote, but I can remember when my niece was very little. She's, I guess, about 14 now or something. One of my brother's friends had an old film SLR, you know, like a camera that you loaded with film, and took a picture of her. And the first, she said, "Oh, can I see?" And the guy was like, "Well, no." And she was completely discombobulated, because at that point, at no point up until that moment in her life had anyone ever taken a photograph that you then didn't instantly turn around the device and look at. And you know, a few years before that, that would have been inconceivable. So I think we do need to be aware that things will be bubbling under that we can't predict, but things that could be sort of incredibly productive. And on a more sort of recent level, people have mentioned pulling things in from outside of the sector. Just as an example, one of the, just in terms of sort of creative responses, nothing to do with music, but to try and get jury trials up and running again, the Scottish court system has used cinemas so that they can have socially distant, you know, with the two-way feed from the court to the jury, socially distanced in the cinema. And if you'd have said in January, jury trials will be happening in, you know, the local Omni Centre, you'd have been laughed, pardon the pun, out of court. So I think you know, and I'm not suggesting therefore all gigs go into cinemas, but the potential for looking out, you know, left field from our own sector to see what's happening also exists, and is a potential source of inspiration.
Oh,
so
okay.
Two slightly obscure references there, but hopefully some
Oh, it's perfectly fitting, actually, all the points which we were making within the last 20 minutes. So kind of looking into like not only creativity as in the sector, but actually creativity of providing the solutions and going farther afield, and something which Erika mentioned, the cross-contamination between the areas. Okay, so we reached now 6 o'clock, so it's Friday, so I'm not going to keep anyone for much longer. So just kind of tiny organizational things. First of all, thank you so much to all the participants and actually contributing to this debate. We will have another one coming in October, on 20th of October, jointly with Foreign Policy Centre. So there we will be focusing less on the region itself, but more like how the UK creative culture and industry can actually be used as example a bit more outside of the country. So I'll be circulating information on that one. We will also be sharing video recording and 2 sets of slides that we had here. So thank you again to all the participants, and I'm really thankful for all the insights, inputs, and the comments that we got, because they're going to definitely feed into our work, and we'll spread the information as much as we can. So thank you again to everyone, and have an absolutely lovely Friday evening. And thank you so much for all the contributions. Goodbye to everyone.